But man, we're glad you're here, however or whenever you got here, especially if you're visiting with us today. We're right smack dab in the middle of a series called Parables, where we're talking about the genius of Jesus, this genius method of teaching that Jesus used to, where he would take these small, short, simple stories and use them to communicate these profound truths. And the genius behind the parables were, the parables made these truths more than just handing out rules or big propositions. These parables made these truths for us, one, more meaningful, more personable, but also more memorable. And it's why we still use them today. And not just biblical parables, but Jesus picked up a method that was already in use. We tell fables and stories with morals all the time. We do it with our children. We use story to help lock in truth in different ways. And this was just this genius method that Jesus had. And so we've been plowing through a few parables here, and we basically said this. Jesus would say at the end of some of his parables, he says, hey, whoever's got ears to hear, let him hear. And what he meant was that if you really do believe that Jesus is the way, or you're curious about who he is and what he's up to, and it seemed that Jesus did some really cool stuff, even if you're not really sure about him yet. Basically, Jesus was saying this, but if you really want to know, and if you really lean in and listen with more than just your physical ears, but with your heart, he said, then you're going to be able to begin to hear me and understand me, lead you and guide you to a better way. That's why Christianity was called the way. Jesus just had a better way, and the way that he communicated that was through parables. Now, today, we're actually going to talk topically about, we're going to use a parable, one of my favorites, but it may not be your favorite by the time we're done. Because here's the topic of what we're going to talk about today, right? It's this big word right here. I put it in capital letters and in yellow so you could see it. Responsibility, right? Everybody loves talking about responsibility. Actually, some of you are probably sitting here going, man, I am so glad my spouse is here today. They need this, right? Okay. And that can be true sometimes. All of us could probably use a little bit more of this, but responsibility, we talk about it a lot at our house because it's one of our 3 R's. We have 3 R's. If you ask any of our kids, what are the 3 R's, except for Ellie, she may not be able to pronounce them all yet, but we have 3 R's at our house, and the 3 R's are this: respect, responsibility, and resourcefulness. That's our 3 R's. And everything we do at our house falls under the umbrella of one or more of those R's. Anytime something comes up, a struggle, a tension, a challenge, it always falls under one of those 3 R's, and so we emphasize that: respect, responsibility, and resourcefulness. But today, we're going to talk about responsibility and really just pulling from, I wish I could tell you, man, this is all my wisdom that I just came up with this, me and Jesus one night. But thankfully, Jesus put wiser people ahead of us. And these are things that I learned even from others and that we continue to try to apply to our lives. And so I want to launch that out on us today. And I'll say this up front: whoever has ears, let him hear. Okay, now we got that out of the way. We're going to start with a question. And here's the question for you to consider. Is this question right here? Am I taking responsibility for my life? Am I taking responsibility for the life that has been entrusted to me, right? And that's a big question, but the reason that we need to ask it is because everybody thinks they take responsibility for their lives. Most people, when you talk to them, they would say, yeah, I think I'm taking responsibility for my life. I don't think I'm taking irresponsibility for it. But the reason that we don't recognize that sometimes is this, is because irresponsibility is really hard to see in the mirror. It's really hard to see irresponsibility in the mirror, but the truth is, if we're honest, most of us know that at least there's a little shade of it, or seasons of it, or moments of it, or places in our life where we experience that. So this is an important question to ask, and a couple of reasons why is this: am I really, and the reason we ask, am I really taking responsibility for my life? One, because some of us know, and others of us have discovered, if we don't take responsibility, or if we aren't taking it, our irresponsibility eventually becomes someone else's responsibility, doesn't it? That our irresponsibility eventually becomes someone else's responsibility. It's not a solo thing. It doesn't happen in a vacuum. You can't just say, well, my irresponsibility only affects me, because that's not true. Eventually, your irresponsibility will affect not just you, but everyone around you, especially when it comes to things like our marriage and our children and our workplace and our community or our church or wherever we are. Wherever you have responsibility and you shirk that responsibility, it affects other people. Somebody has to pick up the slack, right? And I mean, a literal example of that is if you're walking through a grocery store and you knock something off a shelf, right? and it's laying there on the ground, and you don't take responsibility for that item that you've knocked off, somebody eventually has to. Somebody has to come through and pick that item up and put it back where it goes. Or if you're in a grocery store parking lot. Okay, y'all think I talk about this all the time because I do, right? With your grocery carts, okay? When you're out there with the cart. And this honestly happened to me 2 weeks ago. It's my curse. I was at Ingalls and Murphy. I'm leaving. It's just getting dark. It's cloudy. It's raining, of course, because that's all it's done for the last year. And I'm going out of the parking lot. I'm on the far end. I'm driving towards the exit, and the boys are with me. And I just happen to see something out of my peripheral. I think at first I think it's a car with no lights on. And so my immediate reaction is I jerk, and then I look. It's not a car. It's a runaway buggy from 100 yards away with perfect timing that squares my back fender and leaves a softball-sized dent. And I go in, and I'm trying to explain this to the guy, and he's like, so you didn't see it coming, but a grocery cart from probably the top of the lot, right? It came and perfect timing squared your car? Really, that happened? I said, yes. And he's, did you see who did it? I said, no, or I would have hit them with my car. I said, I did not see who did it. I was so frustrated, right? But your irresponsibility eventually becomes someone's responsibility, and we have to talk about this. And the second reason we talk about it, and we'll talk more about this in a minute, and this is even more important to you, or it should be, is because at some point, we all have to give an account for what we did with what we've been given in some way. And for Christians, that may mean one thing. If you're not a Christian, you may be like, well, what do you mean? Well, even in different moments of life, but specifically us as Christians have a moment where we have to give an account for that. So it's important that we talk about it. And so just before we get into our parable today, I want to take us way back to our childhood once again for this one little phrase, because this is going to be important setting us all this up. This one little thing that for children all over the world for years have said out loud at some point or other. All children. It's not just in America, but it's everywhere. As a parent of 4 kids, I hear it all the time, especially from my youngest, and having been a kid myself, believe it or not, right? I've even said this once or twice, maybe. And here it is. At some point, all of us have looked at someone, especially when we were younger in our lives, and we've said this right here. That's not fair, right? That's not fair. Have you ever heard that in your lives? Parents, have you ever heard that? It's not fair. I hear it all the time, especially from my 6-year-old, okay? And I love, Diana says that her mom used to tell her, hey, you know what? The fair comes to town once a year, so it's in July. But that's what fair is, right? But it's just not fair. You hear that all the time. And once we hear that, the thing that we know, parents, grandparents, our common response is just simply this right here. Well, you know what, kid? Life's not fair, right? Life's just not fair. And we already know that. We know that life's not fair, and yet there's something in us that really wants things to be fair some, and I'll emphasize, some of the time. And the reason I emphasize that, just let me make this confession right here, and maybe you can relate to this, or maybe it's just me. But I'm really only concerned about fairness when my piece of the pie is the smallest piece of pie. Right? I'm really only concerned about fairness when I get the smallest slice. I'm like, all right, do you ever do that in lunch line, right? You go through, especially when they had the good dessert sometimes at school, which was very rare. And you're like, man, why can't I get a big piece like you got? It's not fair, right? I'm usually only concerned with fairness when I don't get the big piece of pie. Now, when I get the larger piece of pie, I could care less about fair, right? I just say, thank you, God, for your grace in my life, right? God answers prayers. Look at God go, right? That's what I do. God is great, right? I'm only concerned about a lack of fairness when I'm the one who's on the short end of the stick, when things don't go my way. That's when I get concerned about fair. And we're all kind of that way, aren't we? Right? But here's why this is important. The unfairness or the unevenness of life, if we're not careful, can quickly become an excuse for irresponsibility. Right? The unfairness or uneasiness of life is something that can easily move us to leverage our actions in irresponsible ways, because after all, I got the short end of the stick. Things didn't go my way. I didn't get a fair shake. I got overlooked, right? And now you want me to be the responsible person? Why would I? Why would I bother, right? Because I didn't get what was coming to me. In fact, it turns out that you got the extra. You got the benefits. You married the beauty queen. You won the lottery. You got the job. You got the deal. So Why should I be responsible? I have every right to be irresponsible. And if we're not careful, the unfairness and unevenness of life can lead us into this life of making excuses. All right? And let me just say something real quick. If you've ever found yourself in that place, or if you're a person who would say, you know what, if I'm honest, I kind of lean that direction. Please don't do that. And here's why. This isn't about me, because there's enough of us, we'll eventually pick up your slack. There's enough of us, somebody will. All right, so it's less about us. It's inconvenient, but eventually somebody will. But this is about you, and here's why. Because excusing irresponsibility, it leads to a cycle of more irresponsibility and then more excusing, which eventually, I believe this, will eat a hole in your soul. It begins to affect you emotionally, relationally, and ultimately spiritually. And if you continue in that cycle, you are the one who will eventually be most negatively impacted. And you are never going to be happy. Right? Irresponsible people, they just aren't ultimately happy when they become excusers, which leads to more irresponsibility, which leads to more, when you get stuck in that cycle. Benjamin Franklin, he actually said this. If you were came to church today and you're like, man, I don't want to hear any Bible. Well, good news. We got some Benjamin Franklin for you. And here's what he said. He said, he that is good at making excuses is seldom good at anything else. He that is good at making excuses is seldom good at anything else. In our house, we actually have a saying about excuses too that I picked up from an old coach of mine. If you ask my boys especially, they can tell you what our excuse saying around the house is, and it's just this. We say that excuses are just nails in the house of failure, and we ain't building that house at our house. Right? Like when the boys make excuses, that's what we tell them. Sports, school, just getting dressed in the morning. It's like, oh, but I can't, and it's like, hey man, you know what excuses are? And they'll say, nails in the house of failure, and we're not building that house. Right? I mean, that's what I say. You talk to my boys, I mean, we don't, right? That's what we say. Because, right, excuses can lead us into this cycle. If we're not careful, the unevenness and unfairness of life can lead us to make excuses that can lead to a terribly frustrating and empty life. And that's what happens sometimes when we get the short end of the stick. But I'll say this too. It's not just true of people who get the short end of the stick or the small piece of pie. It works on the other side of the ledger as well. And this is what I've seen, and you've probably seen it too. People who get the larger piece of pie, people who get the upside of unevenness and unfairness, the ones who get the extra, the ones who get the extra money, the extra time, the extra opportunity, the extra attention, all of the extra. Right? And some of us have experienced that, and some of us have seen others who have experienced that to the extreme. But do you know what people do with extra stuff? Oftentimes, they're irresponsible with it, aren't they? Or should I say, aren't we? Right? The more money you make, a lot of times, the more money you waste. The more time you have, the more time you waste. The more of anything that you and I have that we don't need, the more we waste. And I'm often irresponsible with the things that I have extra of. And so when life is unfair to me on the winning side, if I'm not careful, I will use my extra and I'll use my benefit, the fact that I have won, to become an excuse for me to also be irresponsible. And that's what happens when we focus on the idea of fair or unfairness on either side. It can dangerously lead us into a place of irresponsibility. And that's why the wrong question for us to ask when we look at our lives and take inventory is it fair or is it unfair? And instead, a better question is the one that we started with. And it's, are you and I taking responsibility for what life has offered us? Right? The real question is, what am I going to do with the hand that I've been dealt? What am I going to do with the slice of pie that I have been handed? And what am I going to do with the opportunity that life, or if you believe, God has given to me? What are you going to do with that? Am I taking responsibility for my life? Now, here's the good thing. All that stuff that we just talked about. And this is incredible. Jesus taught this in one of his parables. Imagine that. And if you didn't pick up on that, that's where we've been going the whole time, right? 2,000 years ago. 2,000 years ago. This is why you should read your Bible, right? Jesus taught about this. And today we're going to be in the book of Matthew. If you want to follow along, we're going to be over there in Matthew 25. Matthew is pretty easy to find. It's the first book in the New Testament. So right after that middle part, it's the next book over to the right. And so Matthew chapter 25, that's where we're going to start. And here's what happens is Jesus gives this parable about the unevenness and the unfairness of life. And in this parable, he actually gives us God's perspective on uneven and unfair and what it looks like. Now, if you grew up in church, this parable has often been referred to or called the parable of the talents, right? And now, Jesus isn't referring to talents like I can sing, I can dance, I can do math without studying, right? I can ride a unicycle on the interstate. It's not exactly what he's talking about here. In this parable, he's actually referencing talent was a measure of money. And this is where he's going to go. Jesus takes something that's very cultural in this first century, and he uses it to teach a lesson about how God feels about fairness and unfairness and our responsibility in the middle of it. Now, let me just warn you a couple things about parables, and preachers love parables, right? We love it. People that are speaking or communicating, we love parables. But sometimes we get a little over-exuberant with parables, and we read into it more than even Jesus read into it. And so in a minute, there's going to be a place in this parable. It's kind of a woo moment, okay? But don't worry, I'm going to rescue you from the woo, okay? It's all right. But even I've heard this every once in a while, been taught, and the more I study, I'm like, okay, it's not that stuff's not in there, but it's not in here. It's not in this parable. But we'll get to that in a minute. It's a secondary kind of thing, but just hold on for that. The other thing about parables is that when Jesus would speak in parables, he would always speak in them in the extremes, like extreme hyperbole, things that could probably never happen. But he would use those extremes to really draw people in to the story and to make his point. And so you're going to see a lot of hyperbole in there. Now, the last thing I'll tell you is, before we get to let me tell you about the end before we even get there. And here's how the parable ends. At the end of this, God doesn't try to fix the unevenness and unfairness of life. He doesn't try to fix it. Instead, he offers us a lesson on how to leverage it in our and ultimately his favor. So just hang on for that together. All right, let's look at this parable together. Matthew 25, we're going to begin in verse 14, and we're right in the middle of a whole bunch of parables. So the very first word that we're going to look at in verse 15 is the word again, because Jesus has been telling parables and parables and parables, and so he launches into this one and he says, and again. All right, so here we go. Matthew chapter 25, verse 14. He says, again, and it is the kingdom of God, if you read in the whole context, or how God thinks about these things that he's trying to teach and hand off to these individuals. He says, it will be like a man going on a journey who called his servants and entrusted his wealth to them. So he's got this big extreme story about this guy going on a journey, and he brings 3 of his servants in, and he entrusts all of his wealth to them. Again, this is something that when they heard this, they'd be like, who would do that? No one would ever do that, right? But again, this is a parable. It never really happened anyway. Jesus is just literally making this story up to make a point. So it says that he entrusted them with his wealth. And basically the word entrust means that the master's going to split up his wealth, and he's going to expect that the people that he gives it to will do their best to manage it in the same way that he would manage his wealth if he were there. That they will invest it in the ways that he would try to invest it and do with it what he would try to do with it, or the way a money manager would manage somebody's wealth. Okay, so verse 15 says this, to the one he gave 5 bags of gold. Now again, how you may have heard this in the past is that to the one he gave 5 talents. But a talent is just a measurement of money. And actually a talent was worth about 20 years of a common laborer's wages. All right. So if we throw that out at about $15,000 a year over 20 years, that one talent would be worth about $300,000 if we go conservative. That one talent of gold would be, a lot of scholars say, around $300,000 to $500,000 in gold. We'll go conservative and say $300,000. So he gives this first guy 5 talents of gold, like $1.5 million to a servant. He just hands it off. It's incredible, right? Hyperbole. Right? So to the one he gave 5 bags of gold, to another 2 bags of gold, like $600,000, to another one, 1 bag, each according to his ability, and then he went on his journey. Now, this wasn't even, was it? He gave 5 to 1, he gave 2 to 1, and he gave 1 to 1, to which a lot of the people standing there would say, hey, wait a second, that's not fair, right? That's not fair, to which Jesus would say, this didn't even really happen. So just chill out and let me tell you my story. I'm just making this stuff up, right? Just take a deep breath. Hang on, right? And by the way, before I go on, what's not fair though? And this is important. It's not fair that they didn't get the same amount, or it's not fair that the guy who had the wealth to begin with could choose how he distributed it. Because that actually is fair. But on the other side, it's not fair. Which this is a free lesson for you, okay? This one's just free. That everything is fair to someone, right? I'll just give you that one for free. Okay, we'll go on. I didn't charge you for that one. All right. Okay. Now, anyway, verse 15, he went on his journey. Verse 16, the man who had received 5 bags of gold, like $1.5 million, went at once. He didn't waste any time. He put his money to work and he gained 5 more bags. It's incredible, right? This guy goes out, he does what he would envision his master doing, and he gets another 5 bags, which people go, there's no way that could even happen that quickly, to which Jesus would say, it's just a story. It didn't really happen, all right? Just making this up. Right, 25:17. Then he goes, so the other one with 2 bags, $600,000, he went out and he gained 2 more. So he goes out and doubles the guy's money as well. But then, verse 18, the man who had received 1 bag went off, dug a hole in the ground, and hid his master's money. Now, at this point in the parable, all the people in the audience would have gone, ooh, right? Whoa, what in the world? Because nobody would do this, not even in their like nobody would take $300,000, even in those times, and dig a hole and just put it in a hole to keep the money safe, right? Even then, there were better ways to keep your money safe than just digging a hole and sticking it in. He's like, who would do that, right? And the people are going, who? They're losing their minds. And says, who does that? Jesus is like, it's a parable, but I'm glad you're listening, right? Okay, so Jesus has got them in. Now, verse 19. He says, after a long time, and when you read like in the Greek, like you can't emphasize this enough. It's like Jesus saying, you could say a long, long time, long, long ago in a galaxy far, far away, right? They weren't even sure their master's coming home, right? After a long time, the master of those servants returned and settled accounts with them. Now, settled account just simply means he wanted to find out what they did with his gold. Right? He's just going to ask the question. He's going to say, what did we do? Verse 21, or verse 20. The man who had received 5 bags of gold brought the other 5. He said, Master, he said, you entrusted me, right? There's our word. You entrusted me with 5 bags of gold. See, I have gained 5 more. Man, and this dude, he couldn't wait for his master to get home, right? He's like, man, I'm glad this guy's home. This has been exciting, right? So he says, look what I've got. And his master replied, well done, good and faithful servant. You've been faithful with, and now here's where Jesus starts messing with him again, right? He says, you've been faithful with a few things, right? To which the audience would be like, a few things? You gave that dude $1.5 million. That's not a few things. And Jesus is like, just hang on, right? We're going somewhere, right? He's like, so I will put you in charge of many things. Come and share in your master's happiness. Right. Then he goes on in verse 22, and he says this, the man with 2 bags of gold also came. He said, Master, you entrusted me with 2 bags of gold. See, I gained 2 more. And again, his master replied, well done, good and faithful servant. You've been faithful with a few things. And now the guy with 5 bags in the story wants to get involved. Time out. You said I had a few things, but now you're saying he has a few things too. All right. And Jesus is like, hang on, even the people in the story. He's talking to both people. Right. He said, I'm going to put you in charge of many things. Come and share in your master's happiness. Right now they're going, wait. This isn't fair, right? The guy with 5 talents was probably going to say, he said, you gave me 5 and I've got it to 10 and you said you were going to put me in charge of many things. This guy only had 2. He only got it up to 4 and he gets many things as well. Right? It's just not fair. It's not even, to which Jesus says that's the point of the parable. Thanks for hanging in there with me. Right? And people are like, well, I guess we're still in. Now, at this point in the parable, if we had a traveling set of musicians or someone hanging around with Jesus, and there were a soundtrack to parables, okay, this is where the music would change. Maybe some ominous piano. Right? Because, you know who's next? The guy with 1 bag. There it is. This guy's got dirt and mud all over himself because he went and dug the box up out of the ground. He's standing there with his 1 talent. Right? Really ticked off at these other guys like, oh man. Right? So then he gets in here and you're going to really be able to appreciate what happens next because this is an example of first century whining at its best. We can't really hear his voice. But this guy's, he's just going to start whining, and if you listen carefully as he begins to explain why he buried the money, he actually subtly blames the master. Because that's what irresponsible people do, right? It's not my fault. It's somebody else's fault, and I'm a whiner, and I couldn't help it, right? All right. And this is what he actually said, Matthew 25, verse 24. Then the man who had received 1 bag of gold came. Master, he said, I knew you were a hard man. He said, man, I knew you were tough, hard to work with, a hard bargainer, a tough business guy, harvesting where you have not sown, gathering where you have not scattered seed. That you're a winner-take-all kind of guy. You don't leave any breadcrumbs on the table. And I was so intimidated. In fact, I was afraid. And so I have to tell you what I did with your gold. But let me tell you, first of all, that this is kind of your fault. Because of the way you are, right? And so because of the way you are, I was a little nervous. And so he goes on in verse 25, he says, so I was afraid, and I went out and I hid your gold in the ground. See, here's what belongs to you. And this is incredible, right? Because Jesus, again, they've been hanging out with Jesus, and Jesus is kind, and he's healing people, and he's hugging kids, and he's doing all this stuff. But Jesus has some tough words. And this is what Jesus says in verse 26. His master replied. Jesus is talking about the master in the story. You wicked and lazy servant. And that word wicked right there could probably better be translated in this context. It's got a couple different ways you can translate it, but it could also be translated as worthless, right? You worthless, lazy servant. In other words, the master's saying, you didn't go bury that treasure because of what you think about me. You went and buried it because you're lazy. You went and buried it because you didn't even think this through. You just did the easiest thing. You took the easy way out. And now that I'm back, now you want to blame me for your laziness. In verse 26, it says, so you knew that I harvest where I haven't sown, gather where I don't scatter seeds. In other words, he says, if you knew that I was so difficult to deal with and that I'm looking for any kind of return on my money that I can get, why didn't you come up with a better plan than burying it? Right? You can't use that excuse now. This doesn't hold water. Verse 27. He said, you should have put my money on deposit with the bankers. So then when I returned, I would have at least received it back with interest. But oh no, you were too lazy to even do that. And you want to blame me. And see, this is Jesus' genius because he's just drawing people in. And in parts, they can't even imagine him telling a story with a master like this. They're like, man, it was like, dang, Jesus, I can't believe Jesus is getting mad. Right? And so they see this happen and some of them are like, get him, Jesus. And so he goes on. And here's another surprise, right? He says, now take the bag of gold from him and give it to the guy that's got 10 bags. Well, now everybody's losing their minds. Wait a minute. Man, this is not fair. Why would we give it to the guy with 10? Shouldn't we give it to the guy that had 2 and made it 4 and now he's got 5, which is at least half of 10, right? This is so uneven. This is so unfair. And Jesus says, give it to the guy that's got 10, right? And then in the next two verses, he kind of wraps this up. And I'll break down part of this for you because it's so important. But Jesus goes into verse 29. He says, for those who have been given more, in other words, for those who have been responsible with what they have, they'll be given more. And for those, as for those who do not have, the ones who are irresponsible with what they have, even that will be taken away from them. And now he's closing this parable up. Now remember, this is a parable, in case this didn't really happen. But Jesus is going to he's not making a big pronouncement here. He's just wrapping a parable. But then he says this. The master says to the other servants, verse 30, and throw that worthless servant outside into the darkness where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Gnashing just sounds better, doesn't it? Gnashing sounds evil, man. This is where people like, especially, man, this is more where modern day people hear this parable and they're going, man, Jesus just threw that dude in hell. Did you hear that? It's like, whoa, hang on. Right? Now, here's the deal with this parable, right? This is a parable. This didn't really happen. Jesus didn't throw anybody anywhere during this story. And actually, this part isn't about throwing people in hell. And it's like, if you want to talk about hell, we can have a conversation. It's an important conversation to have. It's a real thing. And Jesus talks about hell all the time. But this is not one of the places that he was referencing. Although, I've been around many, and I mean, many preachers preaching to me, and this is kind of the part where they'll get there and they'll say, and friends, if you don't do this with that and that with this and this with that, then you're doomed for hellfire and the fires of hell. Here they come. It's pretty good, wasn't it? Yeah, it's pretty good. I think I ain't heard that. Man, this sent little boys in revivals under benches. All right. Again, that's a conversation we can have and should have at some point. But that's not the point of this parable, okay? I could have made that worse too. I could have really gone for it. Now, anyway. But when you read the New Testament in its context, when Jesus refers to weeping and gnashing of teeth, each time that he refers to that, he's actually referring to this act. It's just a sign of frustration. It's incredible frustration. In fact, if you look up the different times where he uses that weeping and gnashing, right? And he's talking about frustration. And here's the situation with this guy. This guy was in the inner circle with all these other guys in his master's presence, and he had, pardon the pun, been given this golden opportunity. He had $300,000 or something close to it that he could go out and manage for his master. And instead, he totally wasted his opportunity. And then he blamed the master for it. And while this isn't a verse about going to hell, it is a verse about a guy who is standing in front of a master who entrusted him with something and realizing that he could have done something much better with it. But in that moment, knowing that he didn't, right? He's left with nothing but frustration. Here's this guy who had this incredible opportunity, and he's totally blown it. And in a last-ditch effort, he tries to blame his boss, and he gets thrown out of the inner circle, which means he's missing out on all of the celebration of what could have been. And he's totally frustrated. And so now I know you're thinking, okay, well, what happens next? Here's the great part. Then Jesus goes on to the next parable. Okay, it's just over. And he just leaves us there. So the question for us is, what's the point? What are we supposed to learn? What are we supposed to walk away from this with? And here's the point. The point is this, is that everybody gets an uneven amount of opportunity. And everybody gets held accountable for what they do with it. We all get different amounts. There's no rhyme or reason to it sometimes. Everybody gets an uneven amount of opportunity, but we will all be held accountable for what we do with the opportunity and the things that we've been given. Everybody has the privilege, everybody has the responsibility to somehow, some way, give an account for what they did with their uneven amount of opportunity. And this opportunity that we've been given, different amounts in different times, because life is uneven and it's not fair. And God's not even trying to make it fair, right? Not in our context. This uneven amount of opportunity, it's not even ours. It's just on loan to us. The things that we do have. And our responsibility is to figure out how to leverage that to its maximum. And you know what? Sometimes even sitting in a room like this, right? There's some people that have 5 bags of opportunity, or in different season of life, people that have had 5 bags of opportunity in some area or arena of life. And there's some of us that have only had 1 bag of opportunity, but then there's the majority of us who end up somewhere in between, in the 2-bag land. Because most of us know somebody, we could list off the people who have it better than we do. Well, let me just tell you what they got and what they have and what they bought and where they went, who they live with and what happened to them and what they got because their dad's that and their mama was this and they were born into it. What am I supposed to do? Right? We all know somebody that's better off. We probably know somebody that's worse. And most of us fall somewhere in the middle with our opportunity. All of us in the room fall somewhere. And the point of the parable is this, is that you have to look at your bag and you have to decide how to leverage it to its fullest. And we all have to refuse to either take it for granted if we have much, or because it's become so, because we got it easy or we just happened upon it, or we have to refuse to make excuses for ourselves because we don't have what somebody else has. That we simply look at what we've been given and then we figure out how to leverage it for all that it's worth. And for us that would call ourselves Christians, we look at how we can leverage it, not just for ourselves, but for the sake of the kingdom of God. How do we advance His kingdom? But even if you're not a Christian, that you would look at leveraging it for the sake of something bigger than yourself. Because I can tell you this, and even people at the end of their lives who never choose Christ, they still say, man, my life was too small to waste just my life on me. People want to be about something bigger. And so the challenge for you and the challenge for me is to decide, how big is my pie and what can I do with it? What's the hand that I've been dealt and how can I leverage it for something greater? The most important verse in that whole parable to me is verse 19 that says, after a long time, and you need to know that God is so patient. After a long, long time, He's so patient and so kind to us. But after a while, He returns to settle accounts with us. And if we take Jesus seriously, and if you read the rest of the parables, and if you believe that there's a God in heaven and that Jesus is His Son, then in some way, and I can't explain it, but you get to give an account for your life. And it can be an awesome thing, as depicted in this parable. Or it can be one of the most frustrating moments of your life. And no excuse and no blame in that moment will make sense for what we've missed out on. It just won't. And so Jesus' challenge was never for us to figure out how to make things fair, but instead to figure out how to take what we have and leverage it for our faith. And so how do we do that? Well, I came across this story as I was preparing for this, and it's a story that a guy named Max Lucado tells. I love Max Lucado. He's just an incredible pastor and teacher and writer. But he told this story about when he was a kid in Sunday school, and the teacher would give them a tear-out coloring sheet of Jesus every week to color. And then she would grab a little tin can. She had a bunch of tin cans, old soup cans and peach and pear cans up on the shelf, and they all had crayons in them. Did you ever have a Sunday school class? They had just crayons and cigar boxes and cans and different stuff like that? We did. And it said the teacher would grab this thing of crayons off the shelf, and she would hand the different cans out to kids just randomly. She would just give them crayons. And this is what she would instruct them to do. She would say this: take the crayons I gave you and color Jesus. Take the crayons I gave you and color Jesus. And Max, he writes this about this story. He says, and so we would. We didn't illustrate pictures of ourselves. We colored the Son of God. We didn't pirate crayons from other cans. We just used what she gave us. And that was the fun of it. Do the best you can with the can you get. I love that. No blue for the sky, make it purple. If Jesus' hair is blonde instead of brown, the teacher won't mind. She's the one who loaded the can. She taught us to paint Jesus with our own colors. God made you to do likewise. He loaded your can. And now he says, take the crayons I gave you and just color Jesus. I love that. And here's my prayer for you this week. That this week, we would be people who look at what we've been given, not what we don't have. And we would decide, I'm not going to take this can of crayons for granted. Right? That what I've been given, that I'm not going to make excuses and I'm not going to compare myself to anybody else around me, because the bottom line is simply this: to whom something has been given, something is required. To whom something has been given, regardless of how big or how small, something is required. And this week, we would simply do this. We would look for some way to take the crayons that we have been given and color Jesus. Wherever, whenever, and on whoever we can. And at the end of the day, when we hold up our coloring sheet in front of our master, here's what I believe. Like any good parent, and like I do every time Ellie brings home a backpack full of coloring sheets from school, because she has made the effort. Every time I pull that coloring sheet out, whether it's inside the lines or out, whether green people or blue people or red people appear, whether daddy is tall or short, and she always draws me shorter than everybody else. But no matter, that as her father, I always say, well done. Enter into this happiness. I love how you painted Jesus today. And I believe that's what God will do for us. Our call is not to get it right. You don't have to turn your talents into $3 million, okay? Don't worry about that. But we are called to use what we have. Right? Do what you can with the can that you get. And this week, that we would be aware of our opportunity to paint people, to color people, using the gifts and talents that we've been entrusted with the person of Jesus. Let me pray for you. Heavenly Father,